Workplaces everywhere are governed not just by laws, regulations and policies that government adopts, but also by rules and processes established by employers and workers themselves as they endeavor to make sure that work is performed productively, safely, and fairly. Today on your program Policy on Track, we shall examine two issues raised at the just concluded International Labour Conference held in Geneva, Switzerland. One is the report on the conference committee on the application of standards, where Nigeria was listed and mentioned for double-footed notes. What does that mean? Simply, Nigeria was listed for infraction of Convention 138 of the ILO on the worst forms of child labor. The other issue we shall highlight today is the debate on promotion of decent work in global supply chains. It gave the workers, employers, and government of the countries opportunity to discuss on global level how to tackle challenges that are emerging as a result of global supply chains. Today promises to be interesting. Don't go anywhere. My name is Mo Wilkie, your host, and you are welcome. Let's remind you of stories that made headlines in the last 1 week in the world of work. The world's top economies will work to tackle excess production capacity in steel and some other industries that have distorted markets. G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in China say the excess capacity problems exacerbated by a weak economic recovery have caused negative impact on trade and workers. This excess capacity in steel industry has led to steel gluts, layoffs, and idled mills. The G20 steelmaking economies will participate in a steel forum sponsored by the OECD in September to discuss the feasibility of forming a global forum on overcapacity. Our Walmart, the American worker group, is collaborating with a group of Chinese Walmart workers in order to fight work schedule changes and low wages. This partnership can boost the clout of the retailer's global workforce. The US and China groups are discussing joint strategies to address challenges that workers in both countries face. The retailer employs 1.5 million workers in the US and 2.3 million worldwide. Such international collaborations are rare. Large American unions have supported labor movements in a few parts of the world over the years, but not in China. The only legal labor organization in China is the state-backed All China Federation of Trade Unions. It is widely considered an arm of the ruling Communist Party. The bodies of 21 women and a man were found in a pool of fuel and water at the bottom of a boat off the coast of Libya. According to MSF, Doctors Without Borders, over 200 survivors were transferred from the dinghy to other boats. Among them are 50 children. Though cause of death is still sketchy, but it's most likely the fumes from the water and fuel mixture could have made them unconscious. Most of these migrants were from Western African countries. The Conference Committee on the Application of Standards is one of the committees that delivers on one of the core mandates of the ILO. It supervises the implementation by member states of their obligation in respect to international labor standards. 14 countries were slated to appear before it at this year's conference for various infractions. Nigeria was among these countries or member states that failed to comply with our constitutional obligation. Nigeria was listed for failure to comply with the minimum age for admission to work and for engaging in the worst form of child labor in the informal and semi-formal sectors.
The Committee on the Application of Standards provides opportunity for the representatives of governments, employers, and workers to examine together the manner in which member states are fulfilling their standards-related obligations. The committee also examines individual cases of members which are not complying with the fundamental principles. Nigeria was listed for not complying with Convention 138. It notes that child labor is more prevalent in the informal sector, which include crafts and artisanal work and street-related activities. Nigeria was also listed for engaging children below 15 years in semi-formal sectors, which includes activities in commercial agricultural plantations, domestic, hospitality services, the transport industry, and garments manufacture.
The good thing is that this ISC is focusing on a very important subject matter, primarily the case of child labor. And incidentally, it happened that Nigeria appeared under double footnote on the subject matter, which is requesting a need for us to upgrade the Nigerian laws to meet up the provisions of Convention 138 on child labor, which is the worst form, second to the worst form of child labor. In Nigeria is expected, therefore, to amend this law to reflect a minimum age of working.
And specifically aspects that were looked at has to do with issues that borders on children being deprived of the opportunity to go on to pursue their academic dreams. That is, most of these children below the ages of 15, instead of being in school, were discovered to be out of school and hawking on the streets, which was acceptable in every clime as child labor. Beyond that, you also discover that in the informal sector, I emphasize informal sector, there are instances where children that are under the age of 15 were also allowed into the world of work. And the belief is that they are not emotionally, physically, and mentally ready for work. So Nigeria was taken to task on that, and unfortunately, government was not around to defend Nigeria's position or respond when the resolution was read today.
But from the side of the employer, organized labor, what was your contribution?
Of Nigerian employer was limited to organized businesses. In organized businesses, there are two facets of it. The first one are those that are under the umbrella of organized business membership organization, like NECA. Those ones, one can say 100% and authoritatively that they are not involved in issue of child labor because they are guided by the labor law provisions of the country. However, we know that there are even organized businesses as well that are not under the umbrella of this representative body. Whereas many of them might be compliant, there might be one or two other ones that are outside our fold that are erring with regards to that. In the same vein, the other aspect of child labor that is prevalent in the society has to do with those in the informal sector, and that is where there are real issues with Nigeria.
The committee deeply deplores the current situation of children affected by armed conflict in Nigeria, especially as it entails other violations of the rights of the child, such as abductions, murders, and sexual violence. Reports were also received on children being recruited and used by Boko Haram as human shields and suicide bombers. The Committee on the Application Standards notes that according to the UNESCO EFA Global Monitoring Report of 2013, Nigeria has approximately 10.5 million children out of school.
A lot of cases were taken today, from Madagascar to Swaziland, to Zimbabwe, to Mauritius, and Nigeria. And in the case of Nigeria, it was in respect of Convention 138, the worst form of child labor, where it was reported that in some instances, a lot of employers do tend to use child labor to advance the cost of employment, especially in the informal sector. Was well taken, and I think the Nigerian delegation also, when the case was taken, made a report on those issues of Convention 133, which also have a direct relationship with the Child Rights Act. Is something that we need to go back home and reinforce and ensure that we get our children and youth in school, and that there must also be a minimum age where which a child can work.
What will have led ILO to call Nigeria to come before this committee?
Well, I think they work with a lot of international agencies, NGOs, and they also take reports from the field on the application of those conventions, because this convention on the worst form of child labor is one of the conventions that have been adopted in the time past, and therefore they look at the application of those laws, especially where we have international agencies that report on those issues. Particularly, I think they were concerned about the fact that in some parts of the country, a larger number of children that ought to be in schools are out of school. And to them, that is something that is of concern. So I think the report must have flown from those reports from the field. And that is what necessitated Nigeria appearing on a double-footed note, which require that we must come and try to speak to the issues and also work towards addressing the challenge.
And for us in the labor movement, our position is that the quickest and the most sure way to deal with child labor in Nigeria in particular is to have a free and compulsory primary and secondary education. And we know that this is very important even to the background of insecurity in Nigeria, growing insecurity. We really need to get the people educated so that the children will not be vulnerable to manipulations.
In its recommendations, the committee requested governments to review the relevant provisions of the labor standard laws in order to address these gaps while tapping on the expertise of ILO.
I'm taking home the very important meeting led by the Minister of Labour in Nigeria with the DG of ILO, where he canvassed for assistance of ILO in capacity building, both in Labour Inspectorate and even collective bargaining in an attempt to reduce misunderstandings within the negotiating bodies, especially, he laid emphasis, building the capacity at the state councils to reduce the level of strike actions in Nigeria.
The way forward is for the tripartite structure to work together towards ensuring that we strengthen our laws and strengthen our procedures and policies to ensure that the child is protected and the child should be in school when he ought to be in school, not on the street, either hawking or trading, and address that issue of what form of child labor as envisaged in Convention 138. It's a possibility. I think the technical assistance that will be given by ILO can also assist in driving the process. And it is expected that we'll come back when the committee will be meeting in November to give a report of how far we have been able to adopt the conclusions of the recommendation.
The second part of that conclusion states that the government should use a tripartite structure to ensure future adherence with the provisions of the conventions on child labor. And the final aspect of it actually enjoined government to build up its inspectorate capacity to reduce the incidence of child labor in the workplaces.
One of the general discussions at this year's ILC was on the issue of the promotion of decent work in global supply chains. The discussion offered an excellent opportunity for workers, government and employers to discuss on global level on how best to tackle the challenges that have emerged as a result of global supply chains. You might be wondering, what are global supply chains? Is it a new terminology? Simply put, global supply chains are now the common way to organize trade investment, employment production all over the world. As good as it appears, the attendant decent work deficit also call for global action. Little wonder it was the star topic for the employers group from Nigeria at the conference.
In many countries, particularly the developing countries, Global supply chains have rapidly created employment and opportunities for economic and social development. However, not all governments and employers have been able to cope with the rapid transformation brought by this exposure to the global economy. Therefore, its negative implications on working conditions. Take, for example, the collapse of the Reina Plaza building in 2013 that claimed over 1,000 lives. It came as a shock to the international community, and it reinforced the call for global action to promote decent work in global supply chains. The general discussion at the conference offered important opportunity for members of the ILO to gain better understanding of how engagement in global supply chains can contribute to sustainable development, inclusive economic growth, and decent work for all.
Then there's another important committee, the Committee on Global Supply Chains. Global supply chain itself is not new. But what you find is that multinationals now break business production, services, models into components, bits and pieces, trying to run away from responsibility. The heart of that in itself, well, some of them will say they are not running away from responsibility, but trying to do smart business. But for us, it has implication. As long as businesses are done in the names of MNCs, then MNCs have responsibility to ensure that their supply chains maintain standards, human rights standards, environmental standards, taxation standards, and importantly, labor standards. And so, of course, the question is about due diligence. How do you monitor and how do you enforce those standards? The guys will say it's not in our hands, it's too complex, we can't do it. But it's not really the case. If you put your heart to it, you will do it. But when you raise up your hand as you give up, there's a deliberate decision to that. You just want to shake responsibility. But we are calling time on them and we're asking them to take responsibility for their production patterns. So that committee has been going on, and like we hear from the workers group discussion every day, it has been the most problematic discussion.
The committee is a very complex committee. It's diverse and fragmented. It cuts across tailoring, textile, clothing, agriculture, horticulture, hospitality, and the rest of others. I have learned a lot from the processes of the committee's meeting. The workers group, the employer group, and the government group. We have had a very wonderful and robust dialogue and deliberations on things that affect workers across the globe, particularly in the areas of the decent work to global supply chain. During the committee meetings with the workers, there was no restrictions. People were free to air the views of the challenges of the global supply chain in decent work areas in their countries, what they felt and what they wanted done.
The discussion offered guidance to governments, employers, and workers' organizations on how to address opportunities and challenges in promoting decent work in global supply chains.
The committee looked at the fact that the decent work in global supply chain could create employment opportunities because of the age and then the population growth as it moves across the country border. Now, when we talk about deficit, especially in the lower end of the chain, where women and youth are mostly affected, we talk about these home workers and people that are recruited to do other menial jobs without proper remuneration, without proper conditions of service, without health, occupational hazard conditions in place, and the time they put into place. And sometimes they are dismissed from work without any compensation. That is what we mean. And it also affects migrant workers. So when you move across to the other borders, neighboring borders to seek job, the same conditions that apply to the indigenes of that country is different to what applies to you. The wages that they earn is different from the wages you earn, irrespective of your qualification. That is what we mean mean by decent work in global supply chain. So what we are saying is that how can we harmonize all these differences to improve on some of these challenges, particularly the migrant workers, the home workers, the women who are kids to the lower cadre of the jobs.
The second issue of importance to us is the ongoing discussion at the committee that is looking at decent work in the global supply chain. This year, a general discussion is being held on that subject. And we're beginning to see the possibility that in 3-4 years' time, this discussion might assume the level of a debate that will lead to the articulation of an instrument in the form of either a recommendation or convention. And we expect that when we get back home, the social partners will sit down together, look at the key conclusions from the general discussion on the same work in the global supply chain, and then start doing the needful even before the instruments. And we hope that as employers or leaders, I hope that it will not really be an instrument, because we are quite wary of additional standards and instruments for regulating the workplace, because we feel that we already have a large bouquet of instruments and standards which government, particularly in the developing countries, are finding extremely difficult to ensure compliance. From the employer's perspective, we are not looking forward to the articulation of an instrument, but that's outside our control. But in case that happens, I think it's good for Nigeria to take the benefit of the 3-4 years grace before discussion before discussion starts on that subject, to have its own internal machinery for ensuring that decent work is integrated into the various supply chains we have at home.
Okay. Before we came, you said you had a start topic. You want to talk about the debate and how far the discussion has gone during this conference.
Well, I think as I've said, for us, I mean, that's really the start topic for the conference. And to put it in a simple language, the workers and the ILO are concerned about increasing decent work deficits in global supply chain all over the world. And in the context of outsourcing, offshoring, the ILO in particular felt time has come to step into the fray and ensure that workers that are working in global supply chain contexts enjoy equal rights as other workers that are working in other contexts. So the whole essence of all this is to make sure that the rights of workers, wherever they are working, right, are protected, and that the quality of the workplace and the quality of life for workers in the workplace is enhanced. That's really the whole essence of this discussion.
Reports show that Pong Ing garment factory in Vietnam doubled, tripled, then exploded in size from 200 workers in 2007 to more than 3,000 workers today. Salaries not only increased, but accidents declined. This is because the business success is rooted in the company's beliefs that being fair to workers is ultimately good for business.
Global supply chains is a complex and politically sensitive issue, but it is a unique discussion as it seeks to address quality of employment at the global level. That will be our package for today. Thanks for being there for us. For your contributions and comments, please use any of our media platforms available on your screen. My name is Mo Ogbonewilki. Bye-bye.